Thank you, Karen. Karen is the puppet master of this whole series of events. So we should have one more round of applause for Karen. Yay, Karen! And my name is David Haydu. I'm the ringleader, timekeeper, and holder of the hook for the next hour. I won't be contributing that much myself. I'll just try to keep things moving along. I teach here at Columbia. I teach in the Graduate School of Journalism. I teach a seminar on arts and culture. I've written quite a bit about comics too. I wrote a book called The 10-Cent Plague, which, relevant to this discussion, has to do with the relationship between comics and politics. In this case, the 10-Cent Plague has less to do with politics in comics than it has to do with comics in American politics. That's a little cryptic. The price of curiosity is $16. Outside. Introduce the members of the panel in alphabetical order, so as to not impose a hierarchy or to gender this. John CAREY is in second here, from on my left. The editorial cartoonist for the Greater Media Newspapers, a group of 10 weekly newspapers in New Jersey. He's a painter and an arts educator, an exhibiting artist since 1979. He's had 19 one-man shows here and abroad and has participated in numerous group exhibitions. He's been the recipient of various grants, including grants from the Pollock Krasner Foundation and the Geraldine Dodge Foundation. He's terrific. Sabrina Jones, let's see, there we go.
Present.
Is the longtime editor and contributor to World War III Illustrated, a long-running journal of political comics. Her books include a graphic biography of Isadore Duncan, FDR, and the New Deal for Beginners. And she contributes to Wobblies, Studs Terkel's Working, Yiddishkeit, and The Real Cost of Prisons. She's currently working on a graphic adaptation of Race to Incarcerate, which, if you haven't read it, is a terrific book by Mark Maurer. Dennis Kitchen, all the way on my left, your right, is a pioneering underground cartoonist whose company, Kitchen Sink Press, cleverly named, published R. Crumb, Robert Crumb, Will Eisner, Harvey Kurtzman, Spiegelman, Charles Burns, and many others other than myself. In '86, Kitchen founded the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, nonprofit organization defending the comics industry. Yes. This is great. And we don't even have an applause sign. This is just great. In addition, Dennis has co-written books on Kurtzman and underground comics for Abrams. He curates art exhibitions and is currently at work on, relevantly, on a biography of Al Capp. Peter Cooper, to my immediate left, is co-founder of World War III. Yes, Peter Cooper. Co-founder of World War III Illustrator, and he's drawn Spy vs. Spy for Mad Magazine for the past 16 years. His graphic novels include The System, Sticks and Stones, and Stop Forgetting to Remember, and he's also published the sketchbook diaries, Diario de Oaxac, yes, and Dawn to Remember, as well as graphic adaptations of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle and Kafka's The Metamorphosis. He teaches comics courses at the School for Visual Arts in Harvard. Now, what we're not going to do here today is present the capsule history of politics in comics and cartooning. We're not going to present a 45-minute survey. Instead, we're going to look at some issues and themes and some questions about the relationship between comics and politics, those two great outlets for humor, thrills, and the grotesque in American culture. First, I want to throw out a couple questions as foundations for the discussion. I'm going to throw these out to anyone on the panel who feels like fielding them. Some foundational questions about the relationship between comics and politics. I think we should start by asking, why comics? What is it about comics? What do comics do uniquely that makes them suitable to the subject of politics, or ill-suited to the subjects of politics? What do comics have that other forms of communication, other arts don't have, that make them suitable to this subject? Anyone? John?
I think that comics are uniquely...
Oh, I'm going to ask, I'll say this one. Move the mic close to you and project.
I think comics are uniquely democratic. You tell somebody you're a painter and they say, oh, what kind of work? Modern? And you tell somebody you're a cartoonist, their eyes light up. It's a very democratic medium, and more people have seen my comics probably in 1 week in the 10 newspapers I'm in than my whole history of painting pictures. So it's a very universal medium.
And I think that democracy extends also to the fact that an artist can self-publish something and get it out there, and it certainly was true when I was starting, that you would be able to photocopy and just self-distribute, and it's been true with the form in general, that it's been considered a low art, but that has actually meant that a large number of people will see it and enjoy it, identify with the form. Mm-hmm. And that was true with the early comic strips, and it's still true today.
Yeah, I very much want to second what John said, having moved from painting into comics myself, and that it's definitely more accessible, and it's a disarming medium. People do have that reaction. They think it's going to be fun. They don't think they have to know anything to understand it. So it definitely opens a lot of doors.
And I'd say ask Boss Tweed. It's great because it's an instantaneous medium, especially in editorial cartoon, to get that quick impact. But even in comics and graphic novels, you kind of lure people in with the pictures and then hit them with the message. And we know today people have less and less time to read those thick tomes, and so the words and pictures combination is ideally suited to a political message.
Okay. Well, how might comics be not so well suited? Are there any limits in your minds to the capacity of comics to do justice to politics? For instance, does comics appeal to youth, or its absorption with youth kind of set up any limits to the way comics could handle politics?
Well, since I've written mostly for adults, I'm constantly frustrated when people want to give them to their children. So it can be frustrating that way. We haven't gotten beyond that idea that this is kid stuff. But we do know that if kids do read your stuff, that it's definitely the earlier you get them, the easier it is to indoctrinate them.
That is certainly an old trope about comics. The comics just aren't for kids anymore. How many articles have had that headline? I've written 8 of them. So, the format will be we're going to hear from each one of the panelists individually for a while, and we're going to start with Dennis. And Dennis, let's start by discussing the seminal figure in the history of comics and cartooning, Will Eisner, with whom you worked and done, and who you knew quite well in life. Will, as a literary figure, approached comics from a literary point of view. No, he didn't approach comics. He didn't approach politics directly or overtly. He approached politics kind of indirectly, or poetically, as a literary figure does. So where do you see politics fitting into Eisner's work, if at all?
Well, he occasionally was overt. In terms of New York City back in 1965, 1966, right after Mayor Lindsay was elected, I think the first Republican in a long time, he did a special 5 or 6 page comic insert for the New York Herald Tribune magazine. And the villains in that one were bureaucrats working under the Abe Beame administration. So that was overt. Earlier in this period, you don't see much politics, although he did bring Adolf Hitler into a strip, I think 6 months before we entered World War II. He had Hitler come to Central City, which of course is New York. And Hitler tries to impress Americans with what a good guy he is, and at the same time undermine us. And Will shows him trying to infiltrate various disenchanted minorities and keep striking out because he finds out that even though they're disenchanted, they're still loyal Americans. And eventually, they in the spirit bring him around to realize the error of his ways. He decides to go back to Germany and reform. And of course, his Nazi henchmen kill him and substitute a duplicate. So that was an overt use, and he actually brought back Hitler in the very, very end of the Spirit in 1952 in the outer space segment, where he has used the German rocket science to make it to the moon. And interestingly, the syndicate at the time thought it was inappropriate to use Hitler, so they had Will at the last minute change his Hitler mustache to a handlebar mustache, and he became a Spaniard because we all know Spain's rocket science was ahead of the curve.
The presence of Hitler in this spirit brings to mind Will's interest in Jewish identity, which flourished in his graphic novels. Do you want to speak to that and to the political content of that work?
Sure. As Will began doing his graphic novels, and the good part of them were autobiographical, some more obviously than others, but he began to do more and more work focusing on the anti-Semitism he experienced himself. And ultimately, the last work he did was The Plot, which was about the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, thank you, which was his most polemic work ever. And at that point, I think he figured controversy didn't scare him. In fact, his next project he had talked about doing was a graphic novel version of the Quran, which would have been pretty dangerous, but he was pushing 90, and I figured he said, "Come and get me" at that point. So yeah, it became increasingly political in that sense.
We could do, I think, both days of this symposium on the subject of Will, and I don't mean to disserve him by moving on, but I do want to ask about Harvey Kurtzman, another artist with whom you've worked closely and done a lot of work for. And we all know of Kurtzman as the creator of MAD, of course, and we all think of MAD as an important vehicle for political parody in the 1960s. I'd like to throw out the question of whether that conception of MAD is a fulfillment of Kurtzman's vision, or a rejection or denial even of Kurtzman's vision. What's the relationship between the politics of the MAD we think of as a political magazine in the 60s and what Kurtzman made?
Well, it's hard to say. Harvey didn't usually address politics overtly either. As a satirist, he liked to stay above political allegiance. He was an observer. I remember once visiting him. He was on the exercycle watching the Jimmy Swaggart show, and I was talking to him, and he was literally watching it. And I said, "Aren't you switching channels, Harvey?" And he said, "No, I like to see how the other America lives and what they think." Speaking for myself as a generation who grew up in the 50s, MAD was, in hindsight, very political. At the time, we didn't think of it that way, but MAD was, as someone once put it, a machine gun attack on American culture. And it was at a time when in the 50s, things were pretty straight and narrow, and institutions and leaders and teachers and ministers were all very respected, and you were expected to take them at their word. I think what Harvey did with MAD was showed us the phoniness and hypocrisy of just about everything in a way that was very eye-opening and liberating. And I think that generation that grew up with MAD in the 50s, in the 60s, was the same generation then that really protested the Vietnam War and that whole, whatever you want to call the hippie generation. They were schooled by Harvey Kurtzman. and it turned out to be politically subversive in a real way.
How did he feel about how Mad had become, under Feldstein, overtly politicized?
Well, he never spoke much about Feldstein. I think you got to remember, Mad was Harvey's baby, and he hated to see what became of it. And in some ways, it became a lot more successful under Feldstein. It reached its peak circulation then. But when we talk about Mad, I think we seldom put Feldstein in the same category as you would Harvey. I think Harvey was proud of what he created. In a way, ironically enough, it became kind of an American institution, even though it was anti-institutional.
Last thing I want to ask you, Dennis, and it's hard for me to even keep my focus, because I'm still thinking about one of the most stunning things I've heard in many, many years, which is the fact that Harvey Kurtzman exercised. It's really unshakable. But moving on, Al Capp. You're writing about Al Capp.
Yeah, I just finished co-writing.
How can we fairly think of Capp as someone other than reactionary right-wing nut job?
Well, in his later years, he was, yes. But you have to remember, for the bulk of his career in life, he was actually a Roosevelt Democrat and quite progressive. If those of you remember General Bull Moose, he epitomized the worst aspects of capitalism. And Capp really was, in many ways, a social progressive, and he was an early feminist. He did a lot of things that might surprise you. But around the mid-'60s, he did a real 180-degree turn, and he did become not just conservative, but pretty seriously conservative, and some of his closest friends became Richard Nixon, Spiro Agnew, William F. Buckley. And he became, he was always much more than any other cartoonist. He was a public figure because he was on The Tonight Show regularly and all kinds of shows. He had his own TV show several times. He had a newspaper column, a radio spot. He was everywhere. It's hard to believe he's largely forgotten now to a larger generation, but he was huge in the culture. So when he switched his politics, it was pretty serious. And remember, his strip was read at its height by about 90 million people a day, so he had quite an audience. I don't think, though, that he was his best as a satirist when he turned to the right, although he did make some points, and I can tell you on a personal level, when I was about 20 years old in college, part of that long-haired Vietnam protesting crowd that he abhorred, he did a parody called Joni Phony at a time when Joan Baez was at her height. And he drew this folk singer who had, she was very homely, and she had no talent, and flies buzzing around her head because she didn't bathe. And of course, the reporters caught up with Joan Baez, and they said, "What do you think about what Al Capp is doing to you?" And she said she abhorred it. She thought it was awful, and she was talking to her lawyer. And of course, Capp had set her up, because when the reporters came to him, he said, first of all, he said, "I'm surprised that Miss Baez finds any similarity between herself and my character." But the real setup line was, he said, "She's a professional protest singer, and she is in a protest movement, and yet when I protest, she calls her lawyers." And he pointed out something that was important, which is, the left doesn't own satire, and so occasionally he scored points, but for the most part, yeah, he became very boorish and not funny, and not, I think, a very successful satirist, because politics overrode everything. And when he was successful, the politics were not obvious.
All right, well, for the sake of fairness, we're going to move on to Peter, and I'm going to need a little help from Karen. If you could come up here. And Peter's going to take the podium. Peter, the podium is yours.
Or is that required? Just even if it's on this, if the lights go on. Hello. I was asked to bring 5 or 6 slides. I brought 53. But I go through them very quickly, and I know that I'll get the hook if I don't. When I first came to New York when I was 9, and I was immediately taken with it. But it had this image of New York as this big, kind of beautiful, exciting place, more of the kind of Frank Sinatra, New York song. And when I moved to New York in 1977, it was more like, well, if you get the lights down, you could tell. But there was the dramatic distance between how I envisioned New York and how it was in certain ways. But then I came to love that New York too. But the version of Sinatra's song came out more like this, with "Start Spreading the News." I want to wake up in the city that doesn't sleep, to find I'm king of the hill, top of the heap. If I can make it there, I'd make it anywhere. But that became the New York that I loved, and I still hear that music playing, actually, and in the best sense. So when I was in art school, this was an important figure. If you can tell, it's Ronald Reagan. And he inspired the magazine that I co-founded with Seth Tabachman. And he inspired the title, too, because the idea that there was going to be this D actor with his finger on the button. And what we found at first, whereas we were talking about world issues, very quickly we realized that what we could talk about was what was much closer to our home, right outside our door, in fact, and that kind of information was something that would really matter to talk about. That's history also, and we weren't just talking about things that we saw in the paper, but things that we experienced firsthand. Thank you very much. And we kept on finding things to talk about, and some of them did tie directly into world issues, but more people started to be involved in the magazine. It never was just a vanity press. It was always about trying to capture work that we saw on the streets that would be on a lamppost one day, and then after the first rain would be gone. And that we felt that was history too, and it was being ignored in the mainstream, and we wanted to, well, we had very much wanted to join in on the underground comics movement, but unfortunately all the head shops had been closed down, and the form of distribution that came with that disappeared. But coming out of fanzine culture and self-publishing, it wasn't a crazy idea just to do a magazine, and that idea was not crazy to a lot of people. And so more and more people like Sabrina Jones participated in editing and publishing the magazine year after year. We are now celebrating our 32nd year of publication. And the secret to our success, we've never made a dime. I know it doesn't sound like a paradigm for work, but it actually is, no joke, the way you get something like this to survive. Because as soon as money is involved, that means somebody has to write a check, somebody has to be a business person. Who gets the money? Where does it go? We're free and clear of all those questions. It was also a place where we could have a communication and talk about what kind of comics we were doing and discuss the politics. And that led me to do something like The System, which I amazingly ended up being able to do for DC Vertigo, which had many of the same kind of concepts that I was addressing in World War III, how money passes from hand to hand, for example, but then it was in this more mainstream venue. Come September 11th, I found that comics and World War III in particular, was a great place. I was especially aware of how important it was to have alternative media, because it was a time when there was a real shutdown in what you could say and where you could find a place to print it. And it was also a time of real frustration over how limited art seemed. Doing political art just seemed like, okay, great, I can do these drawings, I can express these things, but is it changing anything? I can't stop the buildings from coming down. However, actually I found that in this case, my daughter's art was extremely helpful, because I'd come home at the end of the day and I'd just kind of enter her little art world, and it was an exit from my not so pleasant real world. And so within 3 months, we had an issue of World War III out. We were used to selling about 2,500 copies and having mostly contributors come to our meetings, to the release party. When this came out, 300 people came, and then we started having a lot of people who normally weren't coming to us to get their work published, like Art Spiegelman, who are having trouble publishing the ideas that they were doing in mainstream venues. And that's when I truly understood how important it is to maintain something like this. So after 6 years of George Bush, I thought I did want to get a little break from New York, and we decided to, my wife and I decided to move to Mexico and get away. I thought it would be nice to get a break from politics in general. I wanted to try some different kind of art. We arrived in the town of Oaxaca, Mexico, in 2006. The day we arrived, the national elections had happened, and it apparently had been stolen. There was a teacher strike going on, and it blew up into about 25 people were killed, including an American journalist named Brad Will, who we published in World War III. And suddenly there were federal troops there, and I had to face the fact that there was no escaping politics. But I also realized I really wasn't looking for an escape from politics. I just wanted different politics. So this was life around the time. These are photos I took after the federal troops came. Written on their shields, it says asesinos, which means murderers, that a couple of women had boldly walked up and wrote. I kept waiting for them to rearrange their shields, so it said, "Have a nice day." One of the things I discovered there, and the reason why I've slipped this in here, is how art played a role in the process of, in the politics there. It was part of daily life, especially during Day of the Dead, the way art was used by so many different people. Sometimes it was the flag that was part of the charge, sometimes it was a connection to their history, and I did see how, in a very real way, in daily life and across cultural and financial levels, that people of different, from workers to the museums, that their art was playing a role. But I did really discover how small of a world it was through this experience. And coming back to New York, just realized that the problems and the things that happen in Mexico and South America and Europe are directly affecting what's happening right here in New York, and that it's one giant connection. And the rising tides, or the tsunami in Japan, and the fallout from those things, they're all one giant connection. No big surprise. It's a small world. And so, and I'm seeing the connection between all these things more and more. As the tide rises in Venice, it too will rise in Lower Manhattan. And as things are happening now that will potentially be the movement that we've been hoping for a while, that will directly impact on taking a stand and hopefully changing the direction that we've been going, I really am seeing how art and humor can play into politics, and how important it is to have that element in there. And it's one of the things that I noticed so much of the Occupy Wall Street movement, is how much humor is there. And this is one of the things that we as artists can bring to it, writers and all of us. And how democratic of a movement it is. There's a piece that Seth Bachman from World War III did, and that, in fact, I noticed how little art there was in the first round of it, and that I encouraged my students to go down there and be involved artistically. There's now an Occupy Wall Street comic that just came out. One of the protests was at Foley Square, which, by the way, was the same Foley Square where I believe they had the Senate subcommittee hearings. I thought it was a nice dovetailing there. So as the history of these things go on, we're just all walking in a line of doing political art that is part of a movement. And although the revolution may not be televised, I do suspect that it will be illustrated.
Thank you very much, Peter. I'm going to bring up Sabrina Jones now. I'm just trying to find her images. Sabrina, the floor is yours.
Okay, that's me. You're going to stay there and do my
Can you
next
come
thing?
up? Would you mind coming
Okay,
up?
Sure. Okay, looks like my computer at home, kind of. Hey. So I started working on comics on the third issue of World War III, the one you saw that said Captive City with the skeleton between the buildings. So by that point, we were all living, many of us were living in the East Village after art school, and it was definitely a response to the environment. And I was already a political artist, so it was these guys with their comics that kind of lured me from the absolutely wrong medium for me of doing theatrical performance art. Oh, here I am on stage. But to drawing pictures and writing with them. So your fault. This comic is something I did for World War III way back. Remember 2009? Obama was inaugurated, and there was that glow of hope. World War III decided that instead of doing our usual fist shaking at the powers that be, we were going to be positive. We were going to think about everything that was possible, and we were going to do things that we wanted to see. So we had the issue that was called "What We Want." And I had been doing some historic stuff, so I started researching about this great character, Jane Jacobs, who I didn't know about earlier, but she was somebody whose ideas just clicked right in with me in terms of what makes a neighborhood a community. This is something we had been working on with our neighborhood-based politics in the East Village. And she had been someone who her activism had protected a lot of the kind of neighborhoods that we love in New York. She led the charge against modernist urban design and defended the kind of grassroots wisdom that creates communities on a human scale. So I did a capsule biography of her, and I did it in a way that is very kind of World War III, where we had always done kind of first-person narrative, where I framed it with my own experience of neighborhood. So this is the beginning of that strip. The first slide is actually a color poster that was made by Just Seeds, which is now available, based on the content of this strip. But in the strip, I kind of started out thinking about when I first moved to the East Village, and like most people, I didn't move to New York to live in a tenement on the Lower East Side for 20 years. It just happened. I came here, I grew up in Philadelphia. I was like, oh, art museums, the art world, lofts in Soho, but real estate being what it is, that it was that glamour of the metropolis that lures so many of us here, and that is what makes New York such a great place, full of, bright, eager-eyed people from all over. So there you see me rolling back from work into the city thinking, the metropolis, the big city, Bright Lights, Big City. It was around the time of that book. And I was still young enough to do fun things after work. But then I would roll into my neighborhood, and it's like the small city, So this idea of the dynamism of the big city, and the economic engine that attracts all kinds of people, all kinds of money, and then that intimacy that we still need of like, this is my neighborhood. I feel comfortable here with familiar landscapes. And so back 10 years before that, I want to go back to a strip I did in the late 90s. And it's about a real heart of the neighborhood where I was living in the East Side. Charis was a studio. It was a community center where I had a very precious thing, cheap studio space that allowed me to prolong my stay in the city. And this is the long version of the slideshow. Oops. So I was involved. I was asked to do a strip for World War III about the fact that this community center, which had been saved from dereliction by a bunch of former Latino gang members in the late 70s, was, and which was now a kind of multi-purpose community center with people rehearsing and doing political stuff and 12-step. No, it was now threatened with eviction in the turn of the, and in the 90s real estate fever, when Giuliani was saying we should sell off all city-owned space and just take the cash and never mind the social value that's derived from people using this. So at the bottom you see that it was empty in the 70s when the city was getting a little run down when I first arrived, thriving in the 80s, and then this, I ended this strip with a panel where we're all protesting and scaring away the people who want to buy the building, and it says, this isn't real estate, this is a community center. Well, it's now, I don't have a happy ending for that story because we did get evicted in 2002, and it was kind of a key to me leaving the borough of Manhattan. And it's still empty. 10 years later, the building is still empty. There's nothing there. Sorry to bum you all out. Meanwhile, out in Brooklyn, I'm one of my co-editors, contributors to World War III, Nicole Schulman, approached me with what was to be my first entry into history in comics. She was co-editing with Paul Buell this book about early labor historians, and a lot of different artists from World War III were doing different chapters in the history of the Wobblies, and I did this story about the pageant of the Patterson strike, which was a situation where in 1913, these Greenwich Village radical intellectuals hooked up with striking silk mill workers in Paterson, New Jersey, to help support their strike to break the media blackout that the bosses had arranged. So it was interesting, as a villager, seeing there was a sort of our great-grandfathers, the radical artists and intellectuals of the village, and how they had reached out with their activism to create a theatrical event that helped people, who were more, recent immigrants being exploited in the mills across the river. So a couple of these characters I introduce in here. Hey, there we are back on the Lower East Side. John Reed, the radical revolutionary romantic, is rhapsodizing about what he discovers there. He came from the West, and he was kind of an adventurer revolutionary. So I used his words here, and they echoed so much my own excitement about just strolling around the city, that sense of visiting many worlds as you walk around the city, that would then lead him to great ends as what you call a participant journalist. And one of the people he met, he was not above, as much as he loved slumming it, he was not above going to the salons on Fifth Avenue where he met Mabel Dodge, one of the people who brought Cubism to this country. She had just that year, she had helped organize the Armory show that would shock the New York art world with Marcel Duchamp. But she also met the people who were organizing the mill workers, and so she threw her weight into organizing this and getting support for it. So you see that, I love that blending of the sort of artistic avant-garde with the political avant-garde. Some couple decades earlier, now this is from my graphic biography of Isadora Duncan, and I've got to wrap it up in a minute. Isadora was brought here initially to raise money to get out of here. Definitely an avant-garde artist, not always beloved in her native country, but one place she found a sort of bohemian haven was in New York. Hey, here's FDR. That young man with the spectacles in the middle would be the president one day, but at this point he was FDR. He was known in the social scene, FD stood for feather duster, because he was such a lightweight. But his fiancée was volunteering in settlement houses on the Lower East Side, and she educated him there. in ways that would influence his future politics. New York angle, he's a New York boy whose policies would go national. And another New York bad boy was Governor Rockefeller, whose infamous drug laws would be the sort of touchstone of the race to incarcerate and the prison boom that I'm working on now. So this is sort of the national scene that is inspired. It was started in New York with the Rockefeller drug laws, created mass incarceration, which New York is now beginning to scale back. We are one of the few states to actually reduce our prison population. Don't forget to blame the Democrats, too. It's not all Republicans. Bill Clinton's crime bill was one of the major builders of the massive incarceration. And because everybody gets bummed out when I talk about prisons, I wanted to end with a little poetry. Walt Whitman, this is going to appear in an anthology called Bohemians. Walt Whitman is communing with the urban masses, as he did, talking about that unique kind of sense you have of wandering the city and feeling at one with the crowd, as he looked also at the people on Brooklyn Ferry and his reflection in the water, and he speaks to the commuters of the future, which would be us, that he's still watching over us. Okay.
Thank you very hugely, Sabrina. And finally, we have John Carey. John, can you come here?
One more? Well, it goes way back.
Oh, okay.
Okay. All right. I thought I'd pay tribute to some New Yorkers before I got to my stuff, and starting with Jules Feiffer. And here's a. Who was a presence for over 40 years on page 4 in the Village Voice. Here's a quote. Cartoonists are very different from everybody else. Some are class clowns, or they did poorly in school, or they didn't get along with their families, or they live lives underground in hiding from everybody else. One way or another, they are weird. And the only pleasure they get is by drawing. Not all cartoons are like that, but an extraordinary number of cartoonists are exactly like that. And I was among that group. So, let's see here. All right, now here's one. He said, Feiffer started doing anti-Vietnam cartoons as early as 1963. And here's one. Couldn't find a job, joined the Army, sent to Nam, 3 tours of duty, came home detested, can't find a job, amnesty for draft dodgers and deserters, that's cool. What about amnesty for vets? Now, that's a big, serious question that this country was not answering at the time. All right, moving along. I pledge allegiance to my country. Seems like it should start with well, doesn't it? Well. I pledge allegiance to my country, the flag, the church, the family, the neighborhood, Norman Rockwell, Normandy, standing tall, standing rich, standing right, standing white, the United Disney of America. A little bit before the United Disney of 42nd Street came along. You know, there's a segue here from Denis's Will Eisner introduction to Feiffer. Feiffer showed up at Eisner's studio, and I don't think Eisner was that keen on this young artist, but when he found out he was willing to work for nothing, he was really interested. So, and he found out Feiffer knew everything about him. He's like the Jonathan Schwartz with Sinatra. He knew everything about this guy. So, I was going to say. Oh yeah, so Feiffer said he hired me as a groupie. So, all right, one last Feiffer. Here we go, Bush era, almost. As governor of Texas, I have denied 98 stays of execution in 5 years, despite pleas from human rights groups, international tribunals, and the Pope himself. I have approved of more death sentences than any governor in any state in the Union. No problem, Governor Bush, but did you ever use cocaine? Now, there's a two-pronged attack on our candidates and our electoral process. Moving toward a lot of people, the op-ed page started in 1970, and for 13 years, the art editor was Jarrell Krause, and there were so many good artists. It was a pleasure to open that paper up, and one of the things about reading the paper online now, you have to go to that article to see it. You can't see it as part of the composition of those 2 pages. But David Souter, I always thought was an incredibly witty fellow. Now, I would love to have seen the brainstorming process to get that bank image from that fork and grill of that car. I mean, I don't know how he got there, but I love it. It's great. One more, when Brezhnev died, I mean, terrific. Couldn't ask for a better marriage. Richard Searle, who we lost recently, what a life story that man had. But great stuff. Very, very exciting stuff to see in the Times. You don't expect to see Ralph Steadman in the Times, but there he is. Milton Glaser, in need of a Glaser. Nice stuff. And David Levine's Theory of Evolution. Frankly, my dear, I don't give a Saddam. All right. Edward Sorrell, I think, lives about a stone's throw away from here, if I'm not mistaken. And what a line. I mean, he takes us on a journey with that line. And I wrote him a fan letter once and said it was like listening to a great jazz solo. You just see it emerging. You can see the history of his hand. It's a beautiful looping, loping gestural line, and just terrific stuff. This was done just about the time I came to New York City, fall 1975. So the question Americans must ask themselves is this: if Washington could afford to support organized corruption in Vietnam, why can't it support organized corruption in New York? All right. No, Jerry. Now listen carefully. First, I nominate you for vice president. Then, after I resign you, now let me see if I had this right. I pardon you, and then you give me amnesty for draft dodging, and then I nominate you for vice president, and then I become vice president, right? All right. People had fun with Ford. All right. Why not? Let's throw a little excitement into this. Symposium. Those bandoliers are always a dead giveaway. But again, isn't it great stuff? I mean, that line work is just. When he was in his 40s, he said, "I realized that my sketches were more exciting than the finished product." So he let the process show. All right, Hoover and Hitchens. And even though this one's a more polished piece, an earlier work, if it hadn't been constructed with that gestural line, it wouldn't have been that way. You can still feel it, but he likes to let it show now. There's a beauty. I love that earth sliced up like a ham. And that waiter, he really looks like Eric Campbell from the Charlie Chaplin one-reelers, that heavy, beautiful drawing. Okay, Dancing with the Stars. He leads and she spins, I guess. All right, finally, my stuff here. Republicans in Congress threatened to cut funding for public broadcasting. Grover regrets he has but one life to give for PBS. This one was made to order, I think. That was one of the big issues of our time. And the Reverend Terry Jones, what comes around goes around, unfortunately, and still is. Now, when I lived in the city, car alarms were the problem. But now that I live outside, they've been slightly replaced. It seems like there's always one beefy, huge fellow moving 6 leaves across his backyard for about 45 minutes. before he gets in his truck to go to the gym. Okay, current events, Iran, and the GOP family circus. Okay. Now, Nudie thought he was on his way a while back, but Mitty, Michelle, and Perry did not really like that. I really loved making Perry the dog. You know, sometimes another person's appreciation can change your whole outlook on something. I never paid much attention to the family circus. I couldn't help but not read it. But I found out Linda Berry loved the family circus because she didn't have a family like that. So from then on, I always appreciated it. Okay, rougher style for a rougher topic, and finally, the brilliant leader, successfully creating unity, altering stereotypes, and spreading joy throughout the region. No contest, right? Thanks very much.
Okay. Can we have the house lights back on? I don't know who does that. Somebody do that? Or we'll light matches, just glow from within? Okay. We have a few minutes for questions. Oh, you know, let's just have questions with the limited time we have. Okay, we only have what, 5 minutes left. So, okay. So if we have questions from the audience, should folks step up to the microphone? There's a microphone here. I'd ask you to please step up and use the microphone if you have a question, and you could address it to anyone on the panel or someone in particular.
Hey everybody, my name is Anthony Chabon from New York City. Yeah, so I got a question. Have you read comic books while growing up?
What was the question? I'm sorry.
What was your favorite comic book growing up?
All right, the question is, what's your favorite comic book? Anybody want to field that?
Well, I mean, I started out with superheroes, and then I moved into the underground comics, and so I mean, it was sort of the natural line. So yeah, I mean, Spider-Man for sure, and then later everything by Crumb and all the guys that were doing like environmental comics and Fabulous Furry Freak Brothers, all that.
All right, any other questions? Sir, feel free.
Did you ever have to do self-censorship in that you got caught up in an anger or something and you sort of emphasized maybe ethnic background, maybe gotten a little rough on the image, or is that just something that this generation doesn't have any connection to?
Only when I was doing a story based on another person, a friend of mine, and I hadn't asked her permission. She asked me to remove a sex scene, and I honored her wish.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, definitely doing George Bush. I tried to tone down the ethnic references, but.
Okay, we have another question, Miss?
Thank you so much for such an inspiring panel. My question for you is, do you consider yourself journalists?
I guess I'm the newspaper guy. I like to, just because I think it is kind of disappearing, and I add to that. I add to that paper, and I am on the editorial page. So there is that connection with me.
I feel like I started as an artist, so there's a strong sense that everything I approach is with that kind of sense of wanting to make it mine. That isn't necessarily what journalists do, but as I do nonfiction, there's strands of journalism and strands of historian that I still want to be legit in those fields. I don't want to be seen as falsifying it, even though I'm presenting an opinionated, subjective version. And right now I'm adapting a book, this Race to Incarcerate, that's written by it's a very well-documented, look at social history, and so I have the author to pull me back if I start to go too far and overstate something, because it's a very well-researched argument, and I'm not being allowed to, do anything. I have to do my throw my flames in the pictures, not in the text. Because I find people will correct your text. I've never been copy edited on the picture, except for that friend with the sex scene. But usually it seems like you can draw whatever you want, but they'll correct what you write.
Peter?
I would just add that journalists have to be neutral by nature and suppress their own feelings. And I think if you're a cartoonist and you do that, you're probably going to be boring pretty fast. I think rewarded for being more entertaining. But at the same time, you are a journalist, you're observing the culture, society, kind of regurgitating it back. But you have to do it in an entertaining way that a journalist usually can't.
One of the things that really interests me about comics is as a medium, it is so wide open to all these different areas. You can do autobiography, you can do biography, and journalism is certainly an aspect of that is just beginning to be explored with people like Joe Sacco in particular, doing true, solid, amazing journalism using comics. And they're highly entertaining, even though they're sometimes very straight on, and they're actually opinionated. I mean, it's not like he's trying to cover the subject matter in an important, in a clear way. But I just think that's one of the areas that comics can open up that it's only in its infancy that way.
I think that's a perfect way to wrap up, because if you have more interest in journalism, you could come over to the school where I teach and pay $60,000, and we'll help you out. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you to this glorious panel for doing this.